I'll introduce our first speaker, who is Gary Francione. Gary is a legal scholar and professor of law and philosophy at Rutgers Law School. He pioneered the abolitionist approach to animal rights, which he'll talk to us about today. He's spoken all over the world for a few decades now. He's a real icon in our movement, and we are honored to have him at VeganFest this weekend. Please help me welcome Professor Gary Francione.
If I don't use the microphone, can you hear me? Then I'll use the microphone. All right, now tell me where the timekeeping guy is. Where's the time? All right, and I have 20 minutes, right? We'll see how that works out. All right. First of all, thank you, Paul. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be on this panel with Eunice and Chris, two spectacular people. Let me say a couple of things about animal rights and social justice. I've been doing this now for 35 years. And the number of times I have heard people say, I care about animals, I don't care about humans, has been stunning. The disconnect between human rights and animal rights is wrong. We have to reject that. We have to reject it clearly. And think about it as a matter of simple logic. We reject speciesism because it's wrong. It's like racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, and all these other irrelevant ways of excluding people from the moral community. Well, if we say that speciesism is wrong because it's like those things, we have taken a position on those things. Now, I understand how this happens. I've been kicking around for a long time. The animal groups, the movement is comprised mostly of charities, of corporate charities. They want to keep their donor pools as big as possible. They don't want to be controversial, so they don't want to take a position on women's rights or gay rights or the rights of minorities or the rights of Palestinians or the rights. They don't want to take positions on those issues. We have a position on those issues, and that is we must object to injustice wherever and whenever we see it. As animal people, we have an obligation to do that. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to stop doing your animal work and start doing, working in other social movements. But what it does mean is you've got to support those other social movements. And those other people who are doing work in the other social movements, they don't have to stop and become animal advocates. But they've got to eat, they've got to buy clothes, and we should be encouraging them to eat vegan, to not wear animal clothing, and to otherwise respect the rights of non-humans as we respect the rights of humans. But this idea that we have separated human rights from animal rights has been a real problem. It has been a real problem. And, and we've got to, if we expect to make progress, we have to be clear that we are the modern peace movement, that we embrace everyone, we embrace the fundamental rights of everyone. The difference is our peace movement includes non-humans. But we can't ever, ever, ever lose sight of the fact that fighting for non-human rights commits us to fighting for human rights as well. And it is very disturbing to me when I see, for example, my old friends at PETA with their relentlessly sexist, misogynistic campaigns. We are never going to get, as long as we're treating women like meat, we're going to continue to treat animals like meat. We've got to move away from all that stuff. We've got to get rid of it. We've got to move away from it. We've got to reject it. And we've got to accept that animal rights only make sense once we embrace broadly a concept of human rights. Now, the question that Paul said, why hasn't veganism done as well as we'd like it to do? And there's a simple answer for that. It's the Russians. They're responsible. No. And I think we have failed to make veganism a social movement. Again, the movement is comprised of corporate charities. They want to keep the donor pools as broad as possible, so they stay away from the controversial progressive issues, but they also stay away from the idea that veganism is a moral imperative, it's a moral baseline, because they don't want to alienate the people who aren't vegans. So to the extent that any of these groups talk about veganism at all, they talk about it as a way of reducing suffering. They don't talk about it as a moral imperative, as something we have a moral obligation to do. They talk about it, they say, well, you can be a vegan, or you can eat cage-free eggs, or you can eat crate-free pork, or you can be a reducitarian, or you could be, you could do a meatless Monday sort of thing. All of these things are wonderful, and the answer is no, they're not. Okay? A lot of them are speciesist, and we ought to reject them, and we ought to be clear. If animals matter morally, it's really quite simple. If animals matter morally, veganism is the only rational response. You are either a vegan or you are an active participant in animal exploitation. There is no third choice. Okay? So I want to talk a little bit about, I'm going to be talking at length tomorrow about the abolitionist approach, which is simply the somewhat arbitrary name I've given the work that I used to call it the animal rights approach, but animal rights is now a meaningless expression, so I now call it the abolitionist approach, and that'll probably become meaningless in another 10 years, and I'll have to think of something else. But I'm going to talk about it at greater length tomorrow. But I want to talk a little bit about what the abolitionist approach is, because I think we have failed to systematically understand what it is we're doing. This isn't about, yes, it is about health in the sense that we have a moral obligation to not harm ourselves, and we ought to be concerned about health issues. Yes, yes. But this is an important social justice issue. And we haven't really thought very critically about it. We present it, for the most part, the large groups present it as a lifestyle issue. It's not a lifestyle issue. Any more than being somebody who embraces equality and rejects racism. That's not a lifestyle issue. That's fundamental to who you are as a human being. So I want to talk about the 6 components of the abolitionist approach briefly. First of all, the first principle is if animals are going to matter morally, they've got to have one right, and that is, at least one right, but one right, and that is the right not to be property. Look, if something is animals are property. They have no inherent intrinsic value. They only have extrinsic external value, okay? Now, you might love your dog or your cat, but those animals are your property. If you want, you can take them to your veterinarian today. You have a legal right to dump them at a shelter or take them to a veterinarian, if the veterinarian will do it, and have the veterinarian kill your animal, okay? So, yes, you might not think of your dogs and your cats and the other non-humans who live with you as your property, but the rest of the world does, and they are. They have the value you give them. You may assign them a higher value because you love them. But if you want to keep your dog chained outside and show your dog no affection because you don't value your dog very much, that's fine too. Your dog is your property. Animals are property. They have no inherent intrinsic value. They only have extrinsic external value. Now, we recognized several hundred years ago that if humans are going to matter morally, they couldn't be property. That's why we reject chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery still exists in parts of the world. Indeed, it's a serious problem. Nobody defends it because we recognize that if humans are going to matter at all, whatever else, however else you treat them, what other forms of discrimination you subject them to, if they're chattel slaves, they don't matter at all. They're excluded completely from the moral and the legal community. Similarly, we've got to realize that if animals are going to matter morally, they cannot be property. They cannot be resources that humans use. It simply can't. So we've got to accord them the right, just as we accord, at least in theory, the right not to be property to every human, irrespective of how intelligent that person is, how not intelligent that person is, how beautiful, how talented, it doesn't matter. The individual characteristics don't matter. No human being should be treated exclusively as the resource of another. No human being should be a chattel slave, but no non-human should be a chattel slave either. We have to reject the property status of animals. And that means we have to reject animal use, because all animal use rests on the fact that animals are property. They're things we can use. Okay? If we accord them this right, and we can't do it as a legal matter in the first instance. You can't do it. It's got to be a social thing. This has got to come from us. We have to shift the paradigm. We've got to have a revolution of the heart. We have to shift the paradigm away from property towards non-human personhood. And only then can the law be useful. The law is useless in terms of affecting important social change. Law follows social change. Law does not lead social change. Okay? So you can't look to the legal system. We have to look to ourselves. We have to change. We have to change the way people think about animals and get them to see that if animals matter, then they can't be property. But if they can't be property, then we've just pulled the rug out from under the we just deprived ourselves of the justification of using them in the ways that we use them. So that's point number one. Again, I'm going to talk more about this stuff tomorrow, but point number one, animals have to have the right not to be property. Point number two, if animals have the right not to be property, and if we ought not to be using them, we ought not to be promoting welfare reform. We ought not to be promoting single-issue campaigns. I mean, if it's wrong to use animals, then promoting the supposedly more humane treatment of animals doesn't make any sense. This is where the movement is stuck. We don't have a vegan movement. We don't have a movement. There is no group in this country, not one single one, that promotes veganism as a moral imperative, a moral baseline, something we are morally obligated to do. They present it as a choice, as something that we can choose along with cage-free eggs and crate-free pork and all this happy nonsense. Okay? So what we need to do is to understand that the real problem here, the real problem here is we don't have a rights movement. Nobody talks about animal rights anymore for all intents and purposes. We talk about treatment, we don't talk about use. We talk about how to make treatment better, okay? We don't talk about whether use can be justified at all. I maintain it can't, okay? Now, and I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow, but the welfare movement is deeply problematic. It's deeply problematic for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it encourages animal exploitation. It sends a message to people. You can exploit animals in a compassionate way. You can do the wrong thing in the right way. You know, if you buy cage-free eggs, you're discharging your obligations to animals. No, you're not. Cage-free eggs involve torture. It's a question of whether you got them in a small cage or whether you got them in a larger cage, one larger cage. It's all torture. It's all unjust. It's all suffering. It's all death. They all end up in the same slaughterhouse anyway. How many people in this room have ever been to a cage-free facility? They're horrible. They are absolutely horrible. It drives me crazy when I see my friends at HSUS and Mercy for Animals and all these other organizations praising corporations that agree to buy their, to provide only cage-free eggs, as if this is some sort of improvement. No, it is not. Indeed, it's a step backward because we're sending the wrong message to people. We're saying, you can do something unjust in an all right way and don't worry about it. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow because this is a really important point, and it's a little more complex than I'm making out right now, but we'll discuss it more tomorrow. Welfare reform encourages animal exploitation, okay? It encourages animal exploitation. Single-issue campaigns. You know, when we see all this stuff about the Asians eating dogs, well, I have news for you. You know, if you've ever been to an American slaughterhouse, I want you to tell me that that Asian people are somehow qualitatively different. You know, I mean, we focus on, well, what are they doing to the dolphins in Taiji? What are they doing to the dogs in South Korea? What are they doing to the seals? What are they doing? These single-issue campaigns, the anti-fur campaign, that's been going ever since I was a kid. I mean, I'm not anymore. But I mean, the first thing I remember getting involved, the first thing I remember was the anti-fur campaign. The anti-fur campaign, fur industry is stronger now than it was back then, and there's no difference between fur and leather and wool. All these single-issue campaigns encourage people to believe that there are better and worse ways to exploit animals, and as long as they're participating in the supposedly better forms, eat your steak, just give us money so that we can get, so we can oppose those barbaric people in Asia who are eating dogs. Yes, I wish the people in Asia weren't eating dogs. I wish the people here were not eating cows and chickens and everybody else. So, I mean, there's really no difference. But these campaigns are really insidious. They're not moving things forward. They're moving things backward because they're sending out a message. Last week, my friends at Farm Sanctuary, I've known these people for, zillions of years. But last week, their director of outreach called vegans fundamentalists and basically said, you know, what you ought to do is consume cows rather than chickens because it takes a lot of chickens to make a cow. And so therefore, you know, if we eat cows, we'll be killing fewer animals. I mean, you know, look, less suffering is better than more suffering. That's clear. Nobody disagrees with that. But we ought not to be promoting the idea that less suffering is somehow a good thing. Okay? Yes, it's better. If I'm going to kill you, it's better that I not torture you. 5 minutes? Holy God. Somebody take him out for a drink. So now I lost my train of thought. In any event, okay. So it's very important to understand that yes, less suffering is better than more suffering. But we ought not to be encouraging the idea. If I'm going to kill you, I shouldn't torture you. But we shouldn't be saying, oh, okay, I should go ahead and kill you anyway, as long as I don't torture you. That's what the movement's doing. It's sending confused messages. We've got to be clear. Principle number 3, veganism is the moral baseline. This is a matter of fundamental justice. If animals matter morally, we can't eat them, wear them, or use them. End of story. And there's no distinction between meat and other animal products. Animals used for dairy and eggs, kept alive longer, treated every bit as badly, they all end up in the same slaughterhouse. Frankly, it's drawing the line between meat and other animal products is an incoherent thing to do. We've got to be clear. Veganism is a moral baseline. It's not a lifestyle matter. It's a matter of fundamental justice. Fourth principle is that we are talking only about sentience as a characteristic. This idea that dolphins matter more because they're monogamous and other yeah, that's interesting. Animal behavior is fascinating. Who cares whether they're monogamous? Who cares whether elephants grieve over members of their group that die? I don't care. They're sentient. They're subjectively aware. They feel pain and suffering. That's the only characteristic they have to matter morally. If they have that characteristic, then I believe we cannot morally justify not according them the right not to be treated as not to be treated as property, and therefore we cannot use them. I don't care. There's no difference to me between a fish and a great ape. Yes, there are differences, obviously, and those differences may matter in certain respects, but we shouldn't be using the fish or the non-human great ape as resources for humans. It doesn't really matter whether the fish is not as we don't think that the fish is as complicated or as cognitively sophisticated. That's just humanocentric nonsense, okay? Sentience is the only characteristic that matters. Next principle, the principle I talked about before, is the relationship between human rights and animal rights. We've got to stop otherizing. We otherize non-humans because we otherize each other. Because we draw lines, and and white males are on one side and the rest of the world is on another, and we've got to stop that. We've got to reject sexism. We've got to reject racism. We've got to reject classism. We've got to reject all forms of discrimination which result in excluding people irrationally from the scope of moral concern. The final principle is the principle of nonviolence. Look, the problem is, if violence were ever going to solve this problem, if violence ever solved problems, we'd be living in the Garden of Eden right now, because the history of humankind is a history of violence, mindless violence. It hasn't brought us peace, that's for sure. It's brought us more conflict, it's brought us more violence. Violence begets violence. So we've got to move away from this idea that violence is a good thing or violence is going to solve this problem. It's not going to solve this problem. Several years ago I was in Canada, and someone said to me, well, if a vivisector is using 60 dogs a year, why isn't it, in horrible experiments, why isn't it okay to use violence against the vivisector? And I asked that person, are you a vegan? Yes. Is your mother a vegan? No. And I said, well, then why not? Is it okay to use violence against your mother? I mean, what does she eat? She eats chicken. I said, does she eat chicken more than twice a week? Yes. Well, she's killing a lot more than 60 animals a year. Is it okay to use violence against your mother? And the person just got upset with me, and as animal people often do, and they just, she got upset with me and walked away. But I never got an answer. But the bottom line is, we are a movement of peace. It doesn't mean we can't be strong about it. It doesn't mean we have to be pacifist in the sense of not being activists. We've got to be activists. I ask you, please, spend a part of every single day of your life engaging in creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy. If you take the vegans, if you take the lowest number of vegans we've got, the lowest estimate, and each one of us turns one other person on in the next year to veganism, and then that happens again and again and again and again, the world becomes vegan in 20 years, less than 20 years, fewer than 20 years. But that's not going to happen. But it could happen if we don't ever underestimate the importance of education. It's the most important tool we have to change the world. So please, creative, nonviolent, vegan advocacy. Let us change the world. Let us bring about that revolution of the heart. And understand something. Veganism is a moral imperative. It's not about lifestyle. It's about what our moral obligations are to the other animals with whom we share this planet. I look forward to talking with you while I'm here, and tomorrow I'm going to do a much longer session about this, and those of you who disagree can yell at me. It won't be the first time, but anyway, peace. Thank you very much.